Night lay heavy over Lake Texcoco. The water was still, broken only by the slow movement of canoes returning to the city. Across the lake, lights burned along the causeways, marking the paths that tied Tenochtitlan to the shore. From a distance, the city appeared to float, its stone temples and palaces rising from the water like anchored islands. Smoke drifted upward from thousands of hearths. Somewhere within the maze of streets and canals, drums sounded the hours of the night. This was Tenochtitlan at its height. The year was 1519. One of the largest cities on earth. More than 200,000 people lived here, perhaps more. Stone buildings stood in ordered rows. Markets opened at dawn and closed at dusk, feeding a population larger than London, larger than Seville, larger than most European capitals. Fresh water flowed through aqueducts that stretched across the lake. Canoes carried food, tribute, and people across the water in every direction. The city was loud by day, dense with movement and negotiation, but at night it settled into a controlled quiet, watched over by temple fires that never went out. A living city, governed, supplied, defended, and deeply understood by those who called it home. At the center stood the great temple. Its twin staircases climbed toward shrines dedicated to gods who demanded constant care. Priests rose before dawn to offer incense and blood, maintaining agreements believed to keep the world in motion. These rituals were part of a system that explained why the sun rose and why the rains returned. The people of the city lived inside this structure of meaning, shaped by obligation rather than belief alone. From childhood, they learned that the world had ended before. Stories passed down through generations told of earlier suns that collapsed under violence, flood, or darkness. Each age had failed in its own way. The present world, the fifth sun, survived only through effort and discipline. Time moved forward, but it also bent back on itself. Endings were expected. Survival depended on recognizing when balance was slipping and responding before the gods withdrew their support. Lake Texcoco reflected the city back at itself. Temples mirrored temples. Causeways stretched outward like veins. Beyond them lay subject towns, tribute routes, and rival states bound to Tenochtitlan by force and obligation. The empire reached far beyond the water, but the city remained its center of gravity. This is the story of that city as it was lived from within. It begins in the years before 1519, when the system still worked. It ends 2 years later, in 1521, when the city fell silent and the lake ran red with more than reflection. Not a story of inevitable collapse, but of choices made under pressure, of warnings misread, and of a world that believed it understood time well enough to survive what was coming. It was wrong. Morning light reached Tenochtitlan slowly. The sun rose behind distant mountains, the volcanoes that stood watch over the valley. Light spread across Lake Texcoco, catching on the surface of the water before touching the stone causeways that led into the city. Canoes were already moving. Fishermen paddled toward open water, casting nets in practiced silence. Porters carried baskets of maize, beans, and squash from the shoreline markets toward the city center. Smoke drifted upward from household fires as families prepared for the day. The people who ruled from this island city called themselves the Mexica. The name would later be simplified by Spanish tongues into Aztec. But in 1519 they were the Mexica, and they remembered clearly that they had not always been powerful. They were latecomers to the valley. Migrants without land, pushed from place to place before settling among reeds and shallow water in the middle of the lake. For generations they were dismissed as outsiders, tolerated when useful, and punished when weak. Other cities controlled the fertile land. The Mexica survived on what they could build themselves. They built chinampas, floating gardens. Rectangular plots constructed from lake mud and anchored by willow trees, creating farmland where none had existed before. These gardens produced more food per acre than almost any other method known in the Americas. They required constant care, daily attention to water levels and soil quality. The Mexica became experts at this work because survival depended on it. By the early 1500s, that struggle was no longer visible on the surface. The city they built stood at the center of a powerful alliance that controlled much of central Mexico. From Tenochtitlan, roads and waterways carried authority outward to towns that owed tribute in food, cloth, feathers, jade, cacao, and labor. The transformation had taken less than 2 centuries. In the year 1325, the Mexica had been landless. By 1500, they dominated the valley. This rise shaped how they understood power earned through discipline, military success, and the favor of gods who demanded proof of devotion. The Mexica ruled alongside 2 older cities, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Together they formed the Triple Alliance. Each partner had a defined role, and each received a share of tribute collected from conquered territories. Texcoco contributed legal structure and administrative expertise. Tlacopan offered strategic position and manpower. In practice, though, Tenochtitlan dominated the arrangement. Its armies led most campaigns. Its rulers took the largest share. Its temples stood higher than the rest. Tribute arrived on fixed schedules, carried by porters who walked for days to reach the capital. Officials recorded everything. Cotton blankets, measured and counted. Maize, stored in granaries near the center. Feathers from tropical birds, sorted by color and quality. Gold dust, weighed precisely. Cacao beans, which served as currency throughout the empire. Jade stones, carved or raw. Live animals, jaguars, eagles, exotic birds kept in the palace gardens. The system ran with ruthless clarity. Inspectors traveled to subject towns, verifying that quotas had been met. Shortages were noted and punished. Towns that paid what was demanded were left largely alone to govern their own affairs. Towns that resisted were made examples of. Warriors descended, leaders were executed or taken captive, and the tribute demands increased. This was how empire actually worked. Not through constant occupation, but through the credible threat of overwhelming force. Most towns chose compliance. Yet the empire was endured, not loved. Resentment built quietly in places far from the capital. Towns that had been independent now sent their best goods to Tenochtitlan. Young men were taken as warriors or laborers. Local disputes were settled according to Mexica law rather than tradition. The benefits of empire flowed toward the center. The costs accumulated at the edges. In Tenochtitlan itself, most people were not warriors or priests. They worked small plots on the chinampas, shaped stone for buildings, wove cloth on backstrap looms, and prepared food for markets that drew tens of thousands each day. Life continued because its routines were understood. A farmer woke before dawn. He paddled his canoe to the chinampa plots his family maintained, checking water levels and removing weeds. His wife ground maize on a stone metat, the same motion her mother and grandmother had performed. Children learned by watching and doing. Skills passed from one generation to the next without formal instruction. The city functioned through layers of organization mostly invisible to outsiders. Each kalpuli, a neighborhood or kinship group, managed its own lands, temples, and obligations. Leaders were chosen based on ability and service. Disputes were settled through councils that met regularly. Order was maintained through structures people participated in daily, not just through distant authority. At the center stood the Tlatoani, the speaker. In 1519, that was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. He had ruled since 1502, a span of 17 years. His authority depended on success in war and precision in ritual. He consulted councils before major decisions. He observed protocol carefully. Sudden action risked disrupting the balance that kept power stable. Delay often appeared safer. Moctezuma governed within a system where legitimacy required demonstrating divine favor through military victory and ritual correctness. A Tlatoani who failed at either could be replaced. The position carried enormous power, but it also carried enormous responsibility. From within Tenochtitlan, the system seemed proven. The city had grown larger and wealthier with each generation. Tribute flowed inward. Enemies had been defeated. The gods received proper devotion. The sun continued to rise. But the structure had become fragile in ways invisible from the center. The empire depended on fear remaining stronger than resentment. It required subject towns believing that resistance was impossible. It needed the Mexica to appear invulnerable. By 1519, that appearance was about to be tested in ways the system had never been designed to handle. Before sunrise, the temple steps were already worn with use. Priests climbed them in silence, carrying incense and blades wrapped in cloth. Below, the city remained mostly dark. Fires glowed behind stone walls. Canoes rested against the edges of canals. The only sounds were water lapping against stone, and the soft footsteps of men who had risen long before the world stirred. The Mexica believed they lived under the fifth sun. This was cosmology, the framework that explained existence itself. 4 worlds had come before this one. Each had been inhabited by different beings, governed by different gods, and each had ended through catastrophe. The first sun was destroyed by jaguars that devoured its people. The second sun fell when hurricanes tore the world apart, transforming survivors into monkeys. The third sun ended in fire that rained from the sky. The fourth sun collapsed beneath floods that turned people into fish. The present world, the fifth sun, was called Four Movement. It had been created through sacrifice at a place called Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, which had stood abandoned for centuries by the time the Mexica arrived in the valley. According to tradition, the gods gathered there in darkness after the fourth sun ended. They needed to create a new sun, but doing so required one of them to throw himself into a fire. 2 gods volunteered. One was wealthy and proud. The other was poor and humble, covered in sores. The proud god hesitated at the fire's edge, unable to commit. The humble god did not hesitate. He leaped into the flames and became the sun. Shamed, the proud god followed and became the moon. But the new sun did not move. It hung motionless in the sky, demanding payment before it would begin its journey. The other gods realized what was required. They sacrificed themselves, offering their blood so the sun would rise and the world could begin again. This story was the operating principle of Mexica religion. The fifth sun required constant sustenance. It needed blood and hearts to continue moving across the sky. Without this offering, the sun would stop, darkness would return, and the world would end as the others had. Sacrifice was necessary labor, the work of maintaining cosmic balance. It followed calendars, rules, and strict preparation. Priests trained for years to perform these duties correctly. The rituals were precise and controlled, carried out by specialists who understood the techniques and timing required. Blood was offered because it was believed to be necessary, not because it was desired. The Mexica did not celebrate cruelty. They believed they were maintaining the structure of reality itself. Human sacrifice existed in many forms across Mesoamerica, practiced by numerous cultures long before the Mexica arrived. The Mexica were distinctive for the scale. By the early 1500s, thousands of people were sacrificed each year in Tenochtitlan, most of them captives taken in war. This practice shaped Mexica warfare. Battles were fought not only to conquer territory, but to acquire captives. A warrior's prestige depended partly on how many prisoners he took alive. Killing an enemy in battle was less valuable than capturing one for sacrifice. This influenced tactics, weapons, and the structure of military campaigns. The universe operated according to patterns. Time moved in cycles. Certain days invited danger. Others allowed renewal. Leaders consulted specialists trained to read signs embedded in the movement of days. The calendar governed daily life with precision. There were two calendars running simultaneously. The first was the solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days at the end. The second was the ritual calendar of 260 days, formed by combining 13 numbers with 20-day signs. These calendars interlocked like gears, creating a complex system where each day had multiple meanings. Some days were favorable for planting, others for war, others for marriage, others for staying home and avoiding risk. Priests studied these patterns for years, learning to interpret the combinations and advise leaders when to act. Omens mattered because they suggested imbalance. Fires without cause, voices heard at night, lights crossing the sky, animals behaving strangely. These signs demanded interpretation, not panic. They were treated as data points to be analyzed alongside the calendar, looking for patterns that might indicate cosmic instability. Moctezuma governed within this system. His choices affected gods as much as people. Acting too quickly risked disrupting the ritual balance that kept the world intact. Acting too slowly carried its own dangers, allowing threats to grow unchecked. When reports began arriving from the coast in 1519 describing unfamiliar men and animals, they entered this framework. The question wasn't fear, but meaning. Were these signs of imbalance? Did they align with dangerous dates in the calendar? Did their arrival suggest the state of cosmic order was shifting? Rituals continued. Incense burned. Blood touched stone. The sun rose again. The system still worked. But it left little room for errors it had never been designed to face. The Mexica worldview was sophisticated, capable of absorbing complexity and ambiguity. It had guided them through droughts, floods, and military defeats before. Each crisis had been met with ritual adjustment, political maneuvering, and military response. The priests climbed the temple steps each morning, maintaining the routines that had sustained the fifth sun for generations. They believed, with good reason, that these actions mattered, that the world depended on their discipline and precision. They were right about the importance of their work within the system they understood. The sun continued to rise. The calendar continued to turn. The rituals continued without interruption. For now. Night returned to Lake Texcoco with little warning. Clouds gathered low over the water, blocking the stars. Fires burned along the causeways, their reflections broken by slow-moving waves. Inside the city, people finished their meals and secured their homes. Priests remained awake, watching the sky and listening for sounds that did not belong to the night. In the years that followed the fall of Tenochtitlan, survivors spoke of signs. They remembered events that stood apart from ordinary life, occurring roughly between 1510 and 1519. A flame that appeared in the sky and lingered for many nights. A temple that caught fire without lightning or human hand. A woman's voice heard after dark, calling out in grief for children who would soon be lost. These accounts were recorded later, shaped by memory and loss, but they were not invented without purpose. For the Mexica, signs mattered because the world was believed to speak before it changed. The universe communicated through disruption. A people trained to read calendars and interpret patterns naturally searched the past for warnings when catastrophe arrived. Fire in the sky did not require immediate explanation. It required attention. One night, around 1511 or 1512, a pillar of fire was said to rise from the eastern horizon. It burned without smoke and remained visible until dawn. People gathered to watch it from rooftops and causeways. Some described it as shaped like a pyramid or ear of corn, widening at the top. Others simply recalled a light that should not have been there. No announcement followed. no decree was issued. The site was noted and folded into ongoing discussion among ritual specialists. Priests observed, compared, and waited. They searched for patterns in the calendar, looking for alignment between unusual events and dangerous days. A single occurrence meant little. Repetition suggested imbalance. The world did not end the next day, and life continued. But the memory of that light remained, stored away for later interpretation. Another time, the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica's patron god, was reported to have caught fire. This would have been around 1512 or 1513. Flames climbed the wooden structure despite efforts to contain them. Water thrown upon it failed to stop the burning. People ran with jars and buckets, but the fire continued until the wooden roof collapsed. When the flames finally died, damage remained, but the city still stood. Repairs were made. Ceremonies resumed. The meaning of the event remained unsettled. An accident? A sign of divine displeasure? A warning about the temple's physical maintenance? Such stories gained clarity only later. At the time, they existed among many disturbances that never led to catastrophe. The Mexica had lived through droughts, floods, and defeats before. Not every disruption marked an ending. The challenge lay in knowing which warnings demanded change and which belonged to the background of an uncertain world. Voices were said to be heard at night. A woman crying, calling out to her children, warning them of approaching danger. The descriptions vary. Some accounts place her voice near the lake. Others describe it echoing through the streets. Some say she wailed, "My children, we must flee far away." Others remember only wordless grief. People listened, then returned to their homes. Some spoke of it openly. Others dismissed it as rumor or fear carried on the wind. The city had always contained sound after dark. Not every voice carried meaning. Another omen involved the lake itself. Around 1515, the water was said to have risen suddenly without wind or storm, flooding parts of the city and damaging homes near the shore. This would have been genuinely alarming as it threatened the city's foundation. But Lake Texcoco was unpredictable. Water levels fluctuated with the seasons and rainfall. Flooding had happened before and been addressed through engineering and drainage. Still, when combined with other events, the memory took on additional weight. There were reports of a bird, possibly a crane, captured by fishermen and brought to Moctezuma. The bird was said to have a mirror on its head, and when Moctezuma looked into the mirror, he saw strange beings riding on the backs of deer. This story has the quality of allegory rather than literal event, but it appears in multiple accounts recorded after the conquest. After the conquest, survivors searched the past for explanations that could hold the weight of loss. Omens provided a framework that made catastrophe intelligible. They suggested the fall of the city had been preceded by warning, that destruction had not arrived without notice. This was emotionally necessary. It meant the world still operated according to understandable patterns, even if those patterns led to tragedy. This doesn't make the accounts false. It places them within a tradition that understood history as patterned rather than random. Memory reshaped experience to fit expectations learned long before the Spaniards arrived. Signs that once seemed ambiguous took on clarity when viewed through the certainty of defeat. Even during those early years, uncertainty remained. Moctezuma consulted priests and advisors, seeking guidance. Reports of strange occurrences were weighed alongside political concerns. The empire faced unrest in outlying regions. Tribute demands had to be enforced. Alliances required maintenance. No single omen could outweigh the demands of daily rule. The Mexica world didn't interpret signs as commands. They were invitations to caution. Acting too strongly on ambiguous omens risked appearing weak or panicked. Ignoring signs entirely risked cosmic imbalance. The space between these options was narrow, and it demanded restraint. By 1517 or 1518, new reports arrived. These were not cosmic signs. They were practical observations from the coast. Fishermen and merchants described structures on the water that did not resemble any known vessel, large, with white cloth that caught the wind. They appeared briefly, then vanished. At first, these reports were treated like the earlier omens. Strange, noteworthy, but not yet demanding immediate action. The sea had always carried unusual things. Not all of them mattered. Then, in early 1519, the reports changed. The structures returned and did not leave. Men came ashore. They were described as having pale skin and hair on their faces. They wore metal that covered their bodies. They rode animals that no one in central Mexico had seen before. When messengers arrived at Tenochtitlan with news of these strangers, the information joined the list of disturbances. Fire in the sky and strangers on the shore existed within the same framework of interpretation. Both suggested disruption, but neither yet demanded collapse. Moctezuma sent observers to the coast. He wanted detailed reports. What did these strangers want? Where did they come from? How many were there? Were they alone or part of a larger force? The answers that returned were incomplete. The strangers communicated through gestures and broken phrases learned from coastal peoples. They accepted gifts. They demonstrated weapons that made loud sounds and threw metal with force. They seemed interested in gold. Later generations would debate whether the signs were literal or symbolic, whether Moctezuma believed the Spaniards were gods or emissaries of gods. The historical record suggests something more complex. The Mexica were pragmatic observers. They did not mistake humans for deities simply because they arrived in unfamiliar clothing. The strangers did not fit established categories. They were not tribute-paying subjects. They were not rival empires following known patterns. They were not supernatural beings beyond physical harm. They were something new, and the system provided no clear guidance for how to respond. The city remained intact through 1519. Temples still stood. Markets still opened. Rituals still marked the passage of days. The sun continued to rise, confirming that the world, for now, remained in balance. The omens reveal a society trained to search for meaning before action, to interpret before reacting. That discipline had sustained the Mexica through hardship and conflict. It had also slowed their response to dangers that did not follow familiar patterns. As the signs accumulated, they did not yet point to destruction. They pointed to uncertainty. And uncertainty, handled cautiously for generations, was about to meet events that offered no clear interpretation, no calendar date that explained their meaning, and no ritual that could contain their consequences. The first reports came from the coast in the spring of 1519. Fishermen spoke of shapes on the horizon that did not move like canoes. They rose higher than any vessel known in these waters, and carried white cloth that caught the wind. At first, they were watched from a distance. No messengers were sent in haste. The sea had always carried strange things. Not all of them mattered. But these shapes did not disappear. They remained visible for days, moving slowly along the coastline. On the island of Cuba, hundreds of miles to the east, a man named Hernán Cortés was preparing to leave without clear permission from his superiors. He was 34 years old, born in Spain, a minor noble with debts and ambitions that exceeded his station. He had spent 15 years in the Caribbean, participating in the conquest of Cuba and watching other men grow wealthy from ventures he had not led. In February of 1519, he assembled a fleet, 11 ships, roughly 500 Spanish men, a few dozen horses, cannons, crossbows, steel swords, supplies enough for weeks, not months. Many of the men were in debt. Others were young and landless. Some were veterans of earlier campaigns in the islands. Few had clear understanding of where they were going or what they would find. Cortés did not command an army in the way later stories would suggest. He led a small, uneasy force of Spaniards driven by the promise of land, gold, and advancement. The expedition was technically illegal. The governor of Cuba had authorized exploration, but not conquest. Cortés left before that authorization could be withdrawn. They sailed west and then north, following the coastline of what they called New Spain. In early March, they landed near the Maya town of Potonchan, where they fought a brief battle that cost them several men and demonstrated the limitations of their force. Steel weapons and horses provided advantage, but not invulnerability. Here, Cortés acquired translators who would shape everything that followed. A Spanish priest who had been shipwrecked years earlier spoke Maya. A woman, given to the Spaniards after the battle, spoke both Maya and Nahuatl, the language of central Mexico. Between them, a chain of communication became possible. The woman's name was Malintzin, though the Spaniards called her Marina. She would become essential to Cortés, translating, advising, and mediating between worlds. By April of 1519, the expedition reached the coast near what is now Veracruz. This was the edge of Mexica influence, though not under their direct control. Coastal peoples paid tribute to Tenochtitlan, but maintained their own governance. When Cortés landed, local leaders approached cautiously. They observed the strangers, noted the horses and weapons, and sent word inland. Gifts were exchanged. Food was offered in careful amounts. The Spaniards responded with displays meant to impress, firing cannons into the air, riding horses in formation, demonstrating the range of crossbows. These acts were observed closely. They produced interest rather than submission. The coastal peoples had dealt with powerful outsiders before. They understood tribute and negotiation. They saw dangerous men with unusual tools, not supernatural beings beyond comprehension. The strangers bled when cut. They argued among themselves. They needed food and water constantly. They depended on cooperation to survive. Moctezuma's representatives arrived within days. They brought gifts, cloth, featherwork, gold objects crafted with extraordinary skill. These items were diplomatic gestures meant to acknowledge the stranger's presence, while establishing that the Mexico were wealthy and organized enough to give without appearing desperate. The effect was mixed. The Spaniards admired the workmanship and desired more. Cortés sent messages in return, expressing interest in meeting Moctezuma. He presented himself as an emissary of a distant king, requesting passage to the capital. The Mexica observers returned to Tenochtitlan with detailed reports. They described what the strangers wore, what they ate, how their weapons worked, and what they seemed to want most, gold. These reports were precise and practical. The Spaniards were men. Dangerous, yes, but human. They could be killed. They could be managed. Back on the coast, Cortés faced immediate problems. Some of his men wanted to return to Cuba with the gold already acquired. Others doubted the wisdom of moving inland with so few forces. Cortés needed to prevent retreat and bind his men to the campaign whether they agreed or not. He made a calculated decision. He destroyed his ships. Not dramatically in fire and ceremony, but methodically. Some were beached and stripped, others were scuttled. The wood and metal were salvaged for later use. The message was clear: there would be no retreat to Cuba. The only path forward was inland. This decision has been remembered as bold leadership, but it was also desperate. Cortés had no authorization, limited supplies, and a force that could be overwhelmed easily by any organized resistance. He needed success quickly, or he needed allies who could provide what his expedition lacked. As the Spaniards established a settlement they called Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, they began gathering information. They asked questions about the political landscape. Who ruled the interior? Who paid tribute to whom? Were there rivalries? Old resentments? Towns that might welcome support against the Mexica? The answers revealed opportunity. The Mexica Empire was powerful but not universally accepted. Tribute demands created resentment. Some towns had been conquered recently and still remembered independence. Others had long-standing grievances. The empire was held together by fear and enforcement, not loyalty. Cortés understood this quickly. His survival depended on finding allies who had their own reasons to oppose Tenochtitlan. Without them, his small force would be isolated and vulnerable. Indigenous reactions to the Spaniards varied widely. Some coastal communities submitted cautiously, offering food and shelter in exchange for assurances of protection. Others resisted and faced violent reprisal. The Spaniards moved with ruthless efficiency when challenged, burning towns and taking captives to demonstrate the cost of resistance. These acts were noted and remembered. Violence carried messages that traveled ahead of the Spaniards, shaping expectations long before they arrived. Some towns decided cooperation was safer than conflict. Others prepared defenses. Meanwhile, messengers traveled constantly between the coast and Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma received updates on the strangers' movements, their demands, and their growing interactions with local populations. Each report added pressure without offering clarity. Were these strangers a military threat or potential trading partners? Should they be confronted immediately or observed longer? Would attacking them unite other enemies against the Mexica? Would allowing them to continue inland appear weak? Moctezuma chose restraint. He sent more gifts, more elaborate and valuable than before, gold objects, jade, featherwork of stunning craftsmanship. These were intended to impress and delay, to satisfy curiosity without encouraging approach. The strategy failed. Each gift confirmed that greater wealth existed further inland. The Spaniards became more determined to reach the source. By summer of 1519, the expedition began moving away from the coast. They traveled with indigenous guides who had their own agendas. Some were assigned by Moctezuma to observe and report. Others represented coastal towns eager to see what would happen when the strangers confronted the empire. The path led inland toward Tlaxcala, a powerful state that had resisted Mexican conquest for generations. This encounter would determine everything that followed. The Spaniards were entering a world already divided by conflict, resentment, and calculation. They were not conquerors arriving in a unified empire. They were catalysts entering a fractured system where old rivalries could be leveraged and new alliances formed. Cortés had roughly 400 Spanish men, a few dozen horses, and weapons that gave advantage but not dominance. He needed thousands of indigenous warriors willing to fight alongside him. He was about to find them. The world the Mexica had learned to manage was beginning to shift. The strangers from the sea had entered it, not as conquerors yet, but as participants in struggles already underway. The road to Tenochtitlan was now open, and it would be warped not by hundreds, but by tens of thousands. The road to Tlaxcala ran through hostile ground. The land rose steadily as the expedition left the coast, climbing from tropical lowlands into pine forests and volcanic highlands. The air grew thinner. Nights turned cold. The path narrowed, marked by fields worked under watch and villages prepared for defense. Tlaxcala was not a single city, but a confederation of 4 main towns, each with its own leadership, bound together by shared resentment of the Mexica and the need to resist their expansion. For generations, this small state had maintained independence at enormous cost. The Mexica had tried repeatedly to conquer Tlaxcala. They had failed not because Tlaxcalan warriors were superior, but because the terrain favored defense and the population refused to submit. When outright conquest proved difficult, the Mexica chose containment. They restricted Tlaxcalan trade, cutting off access to salt and cotton from lowland regions. They raided periodically, taking captives and demonstrating the cost of continued resistance. The result was a people hardened by constant pressure. Tlaxcalan warriors trained from youth knowing they would fight. Their economy adapted to isolation. Their political structure maintained unity through shared threat. By 1519, They had survived surrounded by hostile territory for longer than most could remember. When Cortés approached Tlaxcalan territory in early September of 1519, he did not find a welcoming reception. Tlaxcalan leaders saw armed strangers entering their land with indigenous guides from regions under Mexica influence. The natural assumption was that this was another Mexica plot, perhaps using foreign mercenaries to attempt what direct assault had not achieved. Warriors met the Spaniards with force. The first battles were hard and close, fought with spears, obsidian-edged clubs, and shields at arm's length. Tlaxcalan forces numbered in the thousands. They attacked in waves, testing the strangers' defenses and probing for weakness. The Spaniards suffered losses. Horses were killed. Men were wounded by obsidian blades that cut deeply when they struck. Spanish firearms and crossbows caused casualties but could not turn the tide alone. The fighting continued for days. Cortés realized quickly that he could not win through force. His ammunition was limited. His men were exhausted. If the Tlaxcalans committed fully, the expedition would be overwhelmed. He sent messages requesting negotiation. He claimed to be enemies of the Mexica. He offered alliance rather than conquest. These messages were ignored at first. Why would strangers traveling with Mexica allies claim to oppose them? But within Tlaxcalan leadership, debate unfolded. Some argued for continuing the assault until the foreigners were destroyed or driven out. Others noticed something useful. The strangers' weapons were dangerous. Their tactics were unfamiliar. Their presence had already disrupted Mexica plans in the region. Perhaps they could be turned to advantage. After nearly 2 weeks of fighting and negotiation, the Tlaxcalan Council made a decision. They would accept the alliance Cortés proposed, not because they trusted him, but because it offered something they had sought for generations, a chance to strike at Tenochtitlan itself. The alliance that formed in late September of 1519 was born of calculation, not trust. Tlaxcalan warriors joined the Spaniards because it offered a path out of permanent encirclement. They brought knowledge of the land, supply lines, and Mexica tactics. They also brought numbers that transformed the campaign immediately. Cortés no longer marched with a few hundred Spaniards. He moved with thousands of indigenous fighters whose reasons for fighting were their own. Some sought revenge for raids and losses. Others wanted to break the tribute system that had enriched Tenochtitlan at their expense. Still others saw opportunity to shift regional power in ways that would benefit Tlaxcala after the conflict ended. These warriors carried food and supplies, reducing the Spaniards' dependence on uncertain local cooperation. They scouted ahead, identifying threats and opportunities. They absorbed casualties that would have ended the Spanish force entirely if borne by Spaniards alone. The indigenous alliance solved Cortés's most immediate problems. It provided manpower, local knowledge, and legitimacy among communities that had long resented Mexica dominance. It also meant the campaign was no longer controlled entirely by Spanish decisions. Indigenous allies pursued their own objectives, settling old scores and securing positions of advantage. The presence of Spaniards intensified existing rivalries rather than replacing them with a simple story of foreign conquest. As the coalition advanced toward the Valley of Mexico, other communities watched closely. Some submitted without resistance, offering guides and provisions while calculating whether this new alliance might succeed. Others resisted and were defeated in battles that demonstrated the combined forces' capability. Each choice reflected local conditions rather than loyalty to a distant capital. The empire's grip had always depended on fear and enforcement. Where that grip loosened, defection followed. Inside the Mexica system, fractures widened. Tribute demands had created resentment that remained hidden as long as resistance seemed impossible. Military campaigns had drained manpower from regions that received little benefit from empire. Rulers installed by Tenochtitlan faced opposition from their own people, who remembered independence or preferred different leaders. When opportunity appeared, some communities chose survival over obedience. They withheld supplies from Mexica forces. They provided intelligence to the approaching coalition. They opened their gates to avoid destruction. Messengers carried these developments toward Tenochtitlan with increasing urgency. Reports described not a small foreign intrusion, but a growing indigenous army moving alongside the strangers. Tens of thousands of warriors, organized, supplied, moving with purpose. This information was harder to dismiss than earlier accounts of unusual men and animals. The threat no longer resembled a foreign curiosity that might be managed through gifts and diplomacy. It resembled a regional conflict pulling outsiders into its center, leveraging old grievances into open rebellion. The empire responded unevenly. Some garrisons resisted fiercely, defending Mexica territory and trying to slow the coalition's advance. Others hesitated, unsure whether reinforcements would arrive or whether defending unpopular positions was worth the cost. Loyalty weakened as alliances shifted, and the certainty of Mexican dominance began to crack. The system had been designed to project power outward through intimidation and swift punishment. It struggled to respond when resistance moved inward, when subject peoples chose defection over compliance, and when the threat came not from outside the empire, but from within it. For the Spaniards, the alliance with Tlaxcala was transformative. It turned a desperate venture into a viable campaign. It provided the manpower needed to challenge the Mexica directly. For indigenous communities across central Mexico, it represented something different. An opportunity to reshape power structures that had favored Tenochtitlan for generations. A chance to escape tribute obligations. A moment to settle grievances that had accumulated over decades. Violence multiplied as the coalition moved forward. Villages suspected of loyalty to Tenochtitlan were attacked. Captives were taken. Property was seized. Old resentments surfaced under the cover of war. The presence of Spaniards provided justification and organization, but the fury often came from indigenous warriors who had their own reasons for fighting. Calling this simply the Spanish conquest obscures what was actually happening. Across central Mexico, communities made choices shaped by fear, resentment, calculation, and opportunity. The Spaniards acted as catalysts and commanders within a conflict already in motion, but they did not create the underlying tensions or control all the violence that followed. By late October of 1519, the coalition approached the Valley of Mexico. They passed through mountain gaps and descended toward the lake system that surrounded Tenochtitlan. The city was visible from high ground, its white temples and buildings reflecting light across the water. Moctezuma faced not a small foreign force, but a growing alliance of enemies with intimate knowledge of the empire's strengths and weaknesses. The city's defenses remained formidable. Its warriors were trained and numerous. But the political landscape around it had changed fundamentally. The Mexica system relied on loyalty enforced from the center outward. When that structure fractured, authority weakened everywhere at once. The Spaniards had not conquered an empire. They had entered a civil war and provided the catalyst that allowed it to expand rapidly. And they were now moving toward its heart, accompanied by tens of thousands of warriors who had waited generations for this moment. The first gifts traveled down the causeway in silence. Porters carried featherwork, cloth, and crafted objects of gold and jade intended for a careful purpose. They moved from the city's center toward the eastern shore, watched by guards who did not speak. Each item had been selected to communicate status and order. The gifts were meant to slow events down, to set terms, and to remind the approaching strangers that they were entering the territory of a capital that measured power differently than they might understand. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin did not rule by impulse. He had governed for 17 years by the fall of 1519. His authority rested on military success, ritual precision, and the ability to maintain order across a fractious empire. He ruled within a system where sudden moves could trigger instability. If he appeared weak, subject towns could rebel. If he struck too quickly against unclear threats, he could unite enemies who otherwise distrusted one another. The empire depended on tribute, alliances, and fear that had been maintained through long practice. Disrupting that balance without clear cause was dangerous. Preserving it required careful judgment. By late October of 1519, messages from beyond the valley were no longer vague. Reports described Cortés moving inland with massive indigenous forces at his side. They described towns switching allegiance. They described Tlaxcala, the old enemy, marching openly alongside the strangers. They described violence, but also negotiation. Gifts accepted, promises made. The threat was not a single foreign column that could be isolated and destroyed. It was a coalition forming in real time, pulling regional grievances toward the city and offering an alternative to Mexican dominance. Moctezuma's council had to interpret this without clear precedent. The Mexica had faced enemies before. They had defeated rival empires, suppressed rebellions, and absorbed defeats without collapse. But this was different in scale and uncertainty. The strangers possessed weapons that killed at distance. Their tactics were unfamiliar. Their intentions remained unclear despite repeated attempts at communication. More troubling was the indigenous support. The coalition included not just Tlaxcala, but communities that had submitted to the Mexica decades earlier. Some had paid tribute faithfully for years. Their defection suggested the empire's foundation was less stable than it appeared from the center. Paralysis begins not as fear, but as competing dangers that cannot be tested safely. If Moctezuma launched a major campaign and crushed the coalition near the mountains, the problem might end quickly. But such a campaign would pull the main army away from the capital, leaving it vulnerable to unrest. Subject towns watching from elsewhere might interpret military deployment as weakness, an opportunity to reduce their own obligations while forces were committed elsewhere. If he waited for the coalition to approach closer, he preserved flexibility and kept the army near the capital. But delay allowed the coalition to grow stronger, to attract more allies, and to demonstrate that the Mexica could be challenged openly without immediate punishment. If he attempted negotiation and failed, he would appear indecisive. If negotiations succeeded but required concessions, he would appear weak. Either outcome could encourage further challenges. Moctezuma consulted priests, generals, and nobles whose interests did not always align. Some urged decisive military action, strike the coalition while it was still forming before it reached the valley. Others cautioned against provoking war before understanding the enemy's full capability. Many pointed out that the coalition's strength came from indigenous support. Force alone might increase that support by confirming fears about Mexican brutality. The debates were genuine. There was no obviously correct choice, only options that each carried severe risks. Moctezuma chose a strategy that had worked before: hospitality. He sent envoys with gifts and formal messages. He attempted to define the strangers as guests, bound by protocol and expectation. In Mexican politics, hospitality was a tool that allowed rulers to control contact, observe behavior, and decide later whether alliance or punishment was appropriate. Guests could be honored. They could also be contained, watched, and ultimately removed if necessary. By establishing the Spaniards as visitors rather than invaders, Moctezuma preserved multiple options while gathering information. Cortés accepted these gifts. He also continued to advance. The strategy achieved one goal. It bought time. Messages traveled back and forth. Gifts were exchanged. The coalition's march slowed as negotiations proceeded. Moctezuma learned more about what the Spaniards wanted, how they communicated, and what leverage might work with them. But the gestures also carried risk. Gifts signaled wealth and drew interest. They encouraged the Spaniards to believe that greater rewards lay ahead in the capital. Each elaborate present confirmed that Tenochtitlan was worth reaching. Meanwhile, the valley remained unstable. The empire's control depended on the steady movement of tribute and the enforcement of obligations. Local governors had to collect goods and maintain order while watching their own populations for signs of revolt. Some communities sensed a shift and began to hedge. They offered quiet support to the coalition or withheld it from Mexica officials. They delayed tribute deliveries. They claimed shortages that might or might not be real. Each small decision weakened the center's authority incrementally. No single act was rebellion, but collectively they suggested the system was under strain. Moctezuma could not ignore these pressures while focusing solely on the approaching strangers. If he marched out with the main army, he left the capital vulnerable to unrest or coup. If he held back, he allowed the coalition to grow stronger and closer. If he attempted to strike Cortes alone while preserving the indigenous allies, he risked misjudging the balance of forces and suffering a defeat that would be visible across the empire. Delay was rational. It preserved the appearance of control. It avoided a potentially disastrous battle outside the city. It maintained internal order while gathering intelligence about an unprecedented threat. Delay was also fatal. Every day the coalition moved inland. More communities observed that resistance was possible. Every rumor increased the sense that the Mexica could be challenged. Every alliance formed outside the valley made the final confrontation harder. Moctezuma's position was not that of a man facing a simple invasion. He faced the possibility of simultaneous civil conflict combined with an unfamiliar enemy whose full capabilities remained unclear. He had to choose between actions that each carried consequences he could not fully predict. When the coalition neared the valley in early November of 1519, Moctezuma made his final choice. He would meet them, not in battle, but in ceremony. He would welcome them into Tenochtitlan under controlled conditions. This decision has been judged harshly for centuries, often framed as weakness or superstition. From within the Mexica world, it was a calculated move. Meeting the strangers allowed the city to control the encounter, to direct their movement through specific routes, and to bind them to ritual and expectation. It also placed the danger inside the city. The conflict would no longer be managed at a distance. It would unfold in streets, courtyards, and temples where power was supposed to be unquestioned. The strangers would see the city's wealth directly. They would observe its organization. They would understand what they stood to gain. Moctezuma's court prepared for the meeting with careful attention to protocol. They organized processions. They gathered more gifts, even more elaborate than before. They rehearsed the ceremonies that would define the encounter as one between established powers rather than conqueror and conquered. They acted as if order could be maintained through correct behavior. For a time, this approach worked. The coalition approached along the southern causeway. Moctezuma met them outside the city in a formal ceremony that followed Mexican diplomatic custom. Words were exchanged through translators. Gifts were presented on both sides. The strangers were escorted into the city and housed in a palace that had belonged to an earlier ruler. The city remained calm. The strangers were observed constantly but treated as guests. The alliance around them was monitored but not directly confronted. Yet the central problem remained. Hospitality could delay violence, but it could not remove it. The coalition had come too far and gained too much to turn back quietly. The Tlaxcalan warriors camped outside the city had not marched for weeks to simply leave. The Spaniards had destroyed their ships and committed to the campaign without retreat. Moctezuma's restraint had preserved the empire through earlier crises. In 1519, it allowed a new kind of danger to cross the threshold and position itself at the heart of the city. The decision was rational within the framework of Mexican statecraft. The outcome would prove catastrophic. For now, though, order held. The city functioned. Markets opened. Rituals continued. Life proceeded under the surface tension of a situation everyone understood could not last, but no one yet knew how to resolve. The city revealed itself slowly. As Cortés and his coalition crossed the southern causeway on the 8th of November 1519, Lake Texcoco opened on both sides. Water stretched outward, broken by chinampas and canals crowded with canoes moving in deliberate patterns. The road narrowed, raised stone above the lake, nothing to either side but open water and the distant shoreline. Guards watched from platforms built at intervals along the causeway. Runners moved ahead carrying news of the approach. The roadway could be defended easily. Bridges could be lifted or destroyed to isolate sections. The city did not sprawl outward like European settlements. It was contained, deliberate, and defensible. For the Spaniards, the sight defied expectation. They had seen towns and fortresses before in the Caribbean and along the Mexican coast. But not a city built into a lake. Stone temples rose above the waterline, their white plaster surfaces reflecting the morning sun. Buildings stood in ordered rows, separated by canals that served as streets. Bridges crossed the water at regular intervals. The scale was immense. Bernal Diaz, a Spanish soldier who would later write an account of the campaign, described seeing towers and buildings rising from the water like scenes from an enchantment tale. The comparison was not literary flourish. It was genuine shock at a level of urban organization that exceeded anything in their experience. They entered in careful formation. Moctezuma met the column outside the city proper. The meeting followed protocol designed to establish hierarchy and expectation. Nobles accompanied the emperor, carrying his litter and arranging his ceremonial clothing. Words were exchanged through the translator Malintzin, who rendered Moctezuma's formal Nahuatl into Maya, which the Spanish priest translated into Spanish. The greetings were elaborate and indirect, as Mexica diplomacy required. Cortés responded in kind, presenting himself as an emissary of a distant king. Gifts were exchanged. Formality governed every movement. This was reception, not surrender, designed to assert control through ceremony. The Spaniards were led inward along the main avenue toward the city center. Streets opened into canals and plazas. Spectators lined the route, watching in silence. Canoes followed alongside in the waterways, keeping pace with the procession. The visitors were housed in a palace that had belonged to Axyacatl, Moctezuma's father, a large complex near the ceremonial center with rooms arranged around courtyards. The accommodations were generous, but strategic. The palace was large enough to hold the Spanish force and their closest indigenous allies. It was also easy to watch. Guards were posted nearby, observing who came and went. For the first days, the arrangement held. The Spaniards explored the areas they were permitted to enter. They visited the great market at Tlatelolco, the northern district of the city that had been absorbed into Tenochtitlan generations earlier. The market overwhelmed them. At Tlatelolco, tens of thousands gathered daily. Each section was organized by trade, food in one area, cloth in another, pottery and tools in a third, luxury goods like jade and feathers in a fourth. Officials walked among the crowds, settling disputes and enforcing standards of measure and quality. Cheating was punished publicly and immediately. The variety of goods astonished the Spaniards. Foods they had never seen, cacao beans used as currency, tomatoes, avocados, turkeys, dozens of varieties of maize and beans. Cloth woven in patterns they could not replicate. Gold worked into jewelry and ornaments with techniques Spanish craftsmen did not understand. Obsidian blades sharper than steel, though more fragile. The market operated with efficiency that required sophisticated organization. Food arrived from throughout the valley and beyond, timed to prevent spoilage. Goods were counted, taxed, and recorded. The scale suggested a level of administrative capability that many Spaniards had not expected to find. Shock was mutual. The Mexica observed the strangers closely. Their weapons were dangerous, but their habits were strange. They demanded food constantly and in quantities that seemed excessive. They showed little restraint in private spaces, urinating where they chose and ignoring Mexica customs around cleanliness. Their animals frightened children and disrupted daily routines. Horses left waste in streets designed for human traffic and canoes, not large animals. Dogs barked at unfamiliar times. The visitors did not move easily within the city's rules. Spanish soldiers examined the great temple complex at the city's center. They climbed the steps and looked into the shrines at the top, where they saw evidence of recent sacrifices. Blood stained the walls and floors. The smell disturbed them. They reported seeing skull racks displaying thousands of human remains, arranged in organized rows. These observations would later be used to justify Spanish actions as necessary responses to barbarism. At the time, they simply confirmed cultural differences that made both sides uncomfortable. For a time, hospitality held. The Spaniards ate what was provided: tortillas, beans, turkey, fruit. They moved with escorts who guided them through permitted areas while preventing access to others. Their contact with the wider population was limited and controlled. Moctezuma continued to send provisions and occasional gifts, maintaining the appearance of calm. Beneath this calm, tension grew on both sides. The coalition forces outside the city remained in camps along the causeways and on the shore. Tlaxcalan warriors numbered in the thousands, watched carefully by Mexica forces who understood what their presence meant. Reports continued to arrive from other parts of the empire describing unrest and defection. The presence of the Spaniards inside the capital complicated every decision about how to respond. Inside the Spanish quarters, fear began to shape thinking. The Spaniards were surrounded by a population that outnumbered them beyond calculation. They had entered the city with limited supplies and no clear exit strategy. They controlled nothing except the ground they occupied. If the Mexica chose to cut off food and water, they would face siege conditions they could not survive. Cortés received reports that Mexica forces on the coast had attacked a Spanish outpost, killing several men. Whether this report was accurate mattered less than how it was interpreted. The Spaniards believed their position was fragile. They feared being surrounded and slowly strangled. Fear did not dominate the city's population. For most people in Tenochtitlan, life continued with careful adjustment. Markets still opened, though some avoided the areas near the Spanish quarters. Rituals proceeded on schedule. Work continued. Children played in the streets and canals. Families prepared meals and tended their chinampas. The strangeness was managed through routine. The foreigners were a disruption, but not yet a catastrophe. People watched and waited, following the lead of their leaders and priests who maintained order through example. But the situation was inherently unstable. The Spaniards were guests who could not leave safely. The Mexica were hosts who could not remove their guests without risking wider conflict. Both sides understood the fragility of the arrangement, and both prepared for the possibility that it would collapse. The turning point came quietly, without ceremony or clear warning. Cortés made a decision that would end the illusion of hospitality and transform the situation from tense coexistence into open crisis. He ordered Moctezuma taken into custody. The seizure was bloodless at first. Spanish soldiers entered Moctezuma's chambers with careful formality. Cortés accompanied them, speaking through Malintzin. He claimed that the attack on the Spanish coastal outpost had been ordered by Mexica commanders and that Moctezuma was responsible. He requested that the emperor relocate to the Spanish quarters for his own protection while the matter was investigated. Framed as a request, understood as a command. Moctezuma resisted. The conversation lasted hours. He argued that he had not ordered any attack. He offered to punish the commanders involved. He suggested sending hostages instead. The discussion went in circles until Moctezuma understood that refusal would mean immediate force. He agreed to move. The Emperor of the Mexica was escorted to the Spanish palace on the 14th of November 1519. He brought attendants and continued to receive visitors and issue orders. The fiction of voluntary arrangement was maintained, but everyone understood the change. The city did not erupt immediately. Many people did not know yet. Others assumed it was temporary, a diplomatic maneuver that would resolve itself. Moctezuma continued to appear in public, to conduct ceremonies, and to govern through established channels. Life appeared to continue as before. But authority had shifted fundamentally. The Spaniards now controlled access to the emperor. They decided who could see him and what messages would be delivered. They attempted to govern through his voice, believing this would preserve stability while giving them effective power. The strategy depended on compliance and the belief that the Mexica system could function with the emperor as a supervised figurehead. For weeks, it almost worked. Moctezuma issued orders. Officials obeyed them, at least publicly. Tribute continued to arrive from outlying regions. Markets opened daily. Rituals proceeded on schedule. The city functioned because its routines were too deeply established to stop immediately. But trust had been damaged in ways that could not be repaired through continued performance of normalcy. Word spread gradually through the city. Conversations in markets and homes. Questions about why the emperor no longer moved freely. Observations about who controlled access to him. The story could not be hidden indefinitely in a city where information traveled through thousands of daily interactions. Resentment built quietly. The Mexican nobility understood the implications better than most. Their authority derived from the emperor's legitimacy. If he was effectively a prisoner, their own positions became uncertain. Some began to withdraw from active cooperation. Others maintained appearances while looking for opportunities to change the situation. By late April of 1520, 6 months after Moctezuma's seizure, the tension had grown, but not broken. Then Cortés received news that forced him to leave the city. A Spanish force had landed on the coast, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for his unauthorized campaign. This was a direct threat to his authority. If he did not confront it, he would lose control of his own forces and likely face execution. Cortés decided to march to the coast, taking most of his Spanish soldiers with him. He left approximately 80 men in Tenochtitlan under the command of Pedro de Alvarado. A calculated risk. The smaller force would be even more vulnerable, but Cortés believed that Moctezuma's continued cooperation would prevent rebellion. He was wrong about what would happen in his absence. Alvarado and the remaining Spaniards faced a city that had been quietly hostile for months. They were isolated, outnumbered beyond measure, and increasingly convinced that the Mexica were preparing to attack. Every gathering looked like conspiracy. Every ritual seemed like preparation for war. In May of 1520, the Mexica prepared for the festival of Tenochtitlan, a major ceremony honoring the god Tezcatlipoca. The festival involved music, dancing, and elaborate public ritual. Nobles and warriors would gather in ceremonial dress to perform traditional dances in the courtyard of the great temple. Alvarado gave permission for the ceremony to proceed, but fear shaped his judgment. Reports reached him, possibly accurate, possibly exaggerated, possibly invented, that the Mexica were gathering weapons and planning to use the festival as cover for an attack on the Spanish quarters. The reports claimed that once the ceremony ended, warriors would turn on the foreigners and kill them all. Alvarado believed he faced an imminent threat. Whether that belief was justified has been debated for 5 centuries. The certainty is what he chose to do in response. The festival began, as it always had. In the courtyard of the great temple, dancers gathered in carefully ordered lines. Drums marked the rhythm. Bells and shells sounded in time with measured steps. Nobles wore ceremonial clothing, feathers, jade, gold ornaments that caught the light. Priests oversaw preparations with practiced attention. The city had been tense for months, but ritual still provided structure. It was one of the few spaces where order could be reaffirmed through familiar actions. The Spaniards watched from positions around the courtyard. They had stationed themselves at the entrances, controlling access. They were armed, but that was not unusual. They had been armed throughout their time in the city. During the height of the festival, they struck. Spanish soldiers moved suddenly from their positions and blocked the exits. Weapons were drawn. Without warning, they attacked the assembled dancers and musicians. Steel swords cut through ceremonial clothing. Firearms discharged at close range. Panic spread instantly through the confined space. Those present had not come to fight. They were unarmed, gathered for ritual, not war. Many were killed where they stood. Others tried to flee and were cut down at the doors. Bodies fell onto the stone floor. Blood pooled around the temple steps. Drums fell silent. The massacre lasted minutes. When it ended, hundreds lay dead. The exact number was never recorded with certainty. Indigenous accounts later described the courtyard as covered in bodies, the water in the canals running red. News moved through the city faster than orders could follow. Cries echoed beyond the temple complex. Runners carried word through streets and canals. Market activity stopped. People rushed to their homes or toward the center, trying to understand. Managed tension turned into open fury within hours. Trust collapsed completely. The Spaniards had violated sacred space during one of the most important festivals of the year. They had killed unarmed participants in religious ceremony. The emperor remained their captive. The meaning of hospitality, already strained, was now destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. The city responded with violence that had been restrained for months. Stones were thrown at Spanish positions. Spears appeared from storage places throughout the city. Causeways were blocked with debris and barricades. Bridges were torn up to prevent movement. Spaniards were attacked wherever they were found outside their fortified positions. Tlaxcalan allies were hunted with particular intensity, targeted not just as enemies, but as traitors to the broader indigenous world. The coalition that had entered the city under restraint now faced a population that no longer accepted delay or negotiation. Moctezuma attempted to intervene. Spanish soldiers brought him to a rooftop where he could be seen and heard by the crowds below. He called out to the people, urging calm. He asked them to stop the violence and allow the strangers to leave peacefully. He promised that order could be restored if they withdrew their attack. His words carried less weight than they once had. Many in the crowd could no longer separate his voice from the violence that had followed his capture. Some shouted back, rejecting his authority. Objects were thrown toward the rooftop. Stones struck the wall near where he stood. The emperor, who had governed for 18 years, could no longer command obedience through speech alone. Authority fractured irrevocably. The Spaniards retreated to their quarters and fortified the entrances, preparing for siege. They no longer attempted to govern through protocol or maintain the fiction of cooperation. Survival became the immediate concern. Violence spread beyond the temple district. Markets closed. Homes were abandoned. Barricades appeared along streets and canals. Fighting broke out in neighborhoods that had not yet seen direct Spanish presence. The city's routines disintegrated as people chose sides, fled, or tried to protect their families from escalating chaos. The Mexica system had depended on restraint enforced through ritual and hierarchy. Once restraint collapsed, control vanished quickly. Orders could not be enforced when people no longer recognized the authority issuing them. Ritual could not restore balance when sacred space had been violated. The presence of foreigners at the heart of power now justified resistance that required no further permission. The Spaniards realized too late what they had unleashed. The massacre had been intended to prevent rebellion by demonstrating overwhelming force and willingness to act decisively. Instead, it created exactly the uprising they had feared, transforming resentment into active warfare and eliminating any remaining possibility of managed coexistence. Alvarado sent urgent messages to Cortés on the coast, describing the situation. The messages were carried by runners who had to fight their way out of the city. They reached Cortés in early June of 1520. By then he had defeated the Spanish force sent to arrest him, adding those survivors to his own command. He began the march back to Tenochtitlan immediately. moving as quickly as possible with a larger but exhausted force. Meanwhile, inside the city, night fell over a place transformed by violence. Fires burned in districts that had been calm days earlier. Shouts echoed across the water. The lake reflected confusion and flame, where it had once reflected temples and order. The breaking point had passed. The fragile arrangement that allowed coexistence had shattered. From here forward, there would be no return to negotiated control, no restoration of the careful balance that had held for months. Tenochtitlan had entered a state of open conflict that neither side could fully command, driven by fury, fear, and the collapse of all the structures that had prevented this moment from arriving sooner. Morning light fell unevenly across the palace courtyard. Stones were scattered where fighting had passed during the night. Smoke drifted from nearby buildings where fires had been set and left to burn. The sounds of the city had changed completely. Drums no longer marked ceremony. Voices carried urgency, anger, and grief, rather than the rhythms of commerce and daily routine. Inside the Spanish-held compound, guards remained alert, watching the causeways and listening for movement beyond the walls. Supplies were low. Water was becoming scarce. The siege had tightened around them in the days since the massacre, and there was no clear path to relief. Moctezuma remained alive, but his authority no longer held the city together. For months he had issued orders under Spanish supervision. Those orders had once carried weight, enforced by a system that had governed the valley for generations. After the temple massacre, they were questioned, ignored, or openly rejected. The people no longer believed that restraint would protect them, or that the emperor could control the situation he found himself trapped within. The Spaniards still believed Moctezuma could be useful. They needed calm long enough to organize an escape or receive reinforcements. The emperor represented the last connection to a system that had once kept order. If he could speak to the people and slow the violence, the situation might still be managed long enough for Cortés to return from the coast with additional forces. It was late June of 1520 when Cortés arrived back in the city with his enlarged command. He had defeated the Spanish force sent to arrest him and convinced many of those soldiers to join his campaign. He entered Tenochtitlan with perhaps 1,300 Spanish soldiers, a significant increase from the original force. But the city he returned to was no longer the one he had left. The causeways were damaged. Bridges had been destroyed. Barricades blocked major routes. The population was actively hostile rather than cautiously observant. The Mexica had used the weeks of his absence to prepare for war rather than accept the status quo. Cortés attempted negotiation. He sent messages requesting safe passage out of the city, offering to leave peacefully if allowed. The messages were refused or ignored. The fighting intensified instead of diminishing. Moctezuma was brought to a rooftop or balcony one final time. Accounts diverge sharply at this point, and they cannot be reconciled with certainty. Spanish sources, written years later, describe Moctezuma being brought before the crowd to appeal for peace. According to these accounts, he wore his imperial regalia and spoke to his people, asking them to stop fighting and permit the Spaniards to leave. The crowd rejected his plea. Stones were thrown. One struck Moctezuma in the head. He was carried inside, injured, and died from his wounds 3 days later. Indigenous accounts tell a different story. They describe a ruler already stripped of meaningful authority, held against his will, and killed by the Spaniards once his usefulness ended. Some accounts describe a stabbing. Others describe strangulation. The details vary between sources, but the responsibility is placed firmly on the captors rather than on his own people. These versions serve different purposes and emerge from different perspectives shaped by survival, justification, and grief. Spanish accounts needed to explain why the emperor died without their direct responsibility. They had held him for months as the key to controlling the city. His death at Spanish hands would confirm that they had murdered the legitimate ruler, undermining any claim to have acted in his interest or with his cooperation. Indigenous accounts needed to preserve Moctezuma's legitimacy and reject the narrative that he had cooperated with his captors willingly. If he died at Spanish hands, he remained a victim rather than a collaborator. If he died calling for resistance rather than peace, his final act aligned with Mexica values rather than contradicting them. The historical truth lies somewhere within these competing narratives, obscured by time, trauma, and the need both sides felt to make his death mean something specific. Certain is the effect of his death rather than its precise manner. Moctezuma's survival had allowed the illusion of continuity to persist for months. His presence, even as a captive, represented a connection to the system that had governed the empire. His voice, even compromised, carried some residual authority that the Spaniards could attempt to leverage. His death ended that completely. When word spread through the city that the emperor was dead, any remaining hesitation disappeared. There was no longer a voice through which negotiation could be attempted. No ritual authority remained that both sides recognized. No possibility existed for restoration of the arrangement that had held, however tenuously, since November. Leadership shifted quickly within the Mexica world. Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, emerged as the new leader. He had been among those arguing for resistance throughout the period of captivity. His authority rested on action rather than mediation, on the promise of driving the foreigners out rather than managing their presence. For the Spaniards, conditions inside their fortified quarters worsened rapidly. Supplies dwindled further. The water supply was cut or contaminated. Attacks along the walls intensified. The force that Cortés had brought back from the coast was larger, but also required more food and water that was no longer available. They could not hold their position indefinitely. The city would not negotiate. Relief was not coming. Cortés began planning an escape. It would have to happen at night, moving the entire force across the causeways while under attack. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the hope that enough of his force would survive to regroup outside the city. Inside the Mexica leadership, war replaced all other considerations. Cuauhtémoc, a young noble who would later become the final emperor, joined Cuitlahuac in organizing the city's defense. Warriors who had been restrained by orders to wait now received permission to act. The causeways were fortified. Canoes were positioned to attack any attempt to flee. Moctezuma's death closed the final space where restraint might have operated. It did not end the fighting. It clarified it. From here forward, neither side expected coexistence or compromise. The struggle would be decided by force, endurance, and the willingness to accept casualties that both sides were now prepared to inflict and absorb. The Mexica world had lost its central figure at the moment when order mattered most. The Spaniards had lost the one tool that allowed them to manage the city without overwhelming force they did not possess. Both sides prepared for what would follow. The causeways would run with blood before morning came again. The lake would fill with bodies. The careful order that had defined Tenochtitlan for generations would collapse into chaos that no ritual could contain and no authority could restore. The struggle ahead would no longer be shaped by protocol, diplomacy, or uncertainty about intentions. It would be decided by survival alone. Rain fell as night settled over the city on the 30th of June, 1520. Clouds pressed low against the lake, muting sound and light. Streets that had once guided orderly movement now funneled confusion and fear. Inside the Spanish-held compound, preparations were rushed and conducted in whispers. Orders were given in short phrases. Weapons were checked one final time. Packs were tied tight. Gold was divided and loaded, weighed by hands that underestimated its cost. The decision to leave had been forced by circumstances that allowed no alternative. After Moctezuma's death, and Cuitlahuac's assumption of leadership, the Spaniards no longer believed they could hold their position. Attacks along the walls had intensified. Food and water were nearly exhausted. Messages from allies outside the city offered no immediate relief. The causeways were fortified against them. The population was actively hostile. Remaining meant slow death by starvation, thirst, or eventual overwhelming assault. Leaving meant exposure to attack while crossing narrow causeways with water on both sides, but it at least offered the possibility of survival. Cortes chose the night, hoping darkness would provide cover. The plan relied on speed and stealth. The Spanish force would move as one column, attempting to cross the western causeway toward Tlacopan on the mainland. Indigenous allies would travel with them, carrying supplies and wounded. Horses would be led carefully, their hooves wrapped to reduce noise where possible. Bridges along the causeways had been removed by Mexica forces to isolate sections of the road and create gaps that could not be crossed easily. The Spaniards constructed a portable wooden bridge, a makeshift structure built from timber salvaged from buildings. This bridge would be carried forward and used to cross each gap, then retrieved and moved to the next obstacle. An optimistic plan that depended on everything working correctly under pressure. Rain worked against them from the start. The stone surfaces became slick. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The lake rose slightly, lapping at the edges of the causeway. Progress slowed as the column assembled and began moving in darkness. They carried treasure taken from Moctezuma's palace and temples during the months of occupation. Gold objects, jade, crafted featherwork. The metal was heavy. Some soldiers distributed it evenly across their equipment. Others concealed extra portions, believing wealth would justify the risk. These decisions were made individually, without supervision, in the confusion of departure. The escape did not remain hidden long. A woman drawing water from the lake saw movement on the causeway and cried out. Her voice carried across the water. Within minutes, drums answered from across the city. Temple drums, war drums, signals that spread the alarm through every district. Canoes launched from canals throughout the city, dozens at first, then hundreds. Warriors paddled toward the causeway, converging on the column from both sides. Torches appeared, illuminating sections of the road, and revealing the retreating force to attackers who now knew exactly where to strike. The portable bridge reached the first gap in the causeway and was positioned to cross it. The column began crossing, soldiers moving carefully over the improvised structure while trying to maintain formation. The crossing took time. Too much time. The bridge sagged under weight. Men stumbled in darkness. Before the entire force could cross, the bridge became stuck. Whether it jammed in the gap or was damaged by weight, it could not be retrieved as planned. The column was now divided, some across the gap and others trapped on the wrong side with no way forward except through water. Panic began to replace order. Canoes struck at the column from the water, warriors using spears and atlatls to attack exposed flanks. Mexica forces attacked from the road ahead and behind, blocking retreat and preventing forward movement. The rain blurred faces and erased direction. Survivors later recalled the sound of bodies hitting water and the sharp percussion of weapons at close range. Men fell or jumped into the lake, trying to swim to the next section of causeway. Armor dragged them under. Those who surfaced were struck from canoes or drowned beneath the weight they had chosen to carry. Horses panicked, rearing and falling, crushing anyone nearby. The column broke into fragments, each group fighting independently without coordination. Gold became an anchor. Soldiers who had taken extra treasure found themselves unable to move quickly. The metal pulled them down in water, or slowed them enough that attackers could close distance. Some dropped their packs to move faster, choosing survival over wealth. Others clung to what they carried and paid for that choice with their lives. The fighting continued for hours, though time lost meaning in darkness and chaos. Spanish soldiers tried to maintain defensive formations, but the narrow causeway allowed no room for maneuver. Indigenous allies fought to clear space, absorbing casualties that would have ended the Spanish force entirely. Tlaxcalan warriors, who had marched for months alongside the Spaniards, died in numbers that were never accurately recorded. Many did not make it out of the city. Spaniards, indigenous allies, Women who had traveled with the column and porters carrying supplies were killed or captured. Those taken alive faced a fate everyone involved understood. They would be sacrificed in ceremonies meant to restore cosmic balance after months of violation and disorder. The lake absorbed the rest. Bodies sank into water that had once carried tribute canoes and fishing boats. Gold settled into mud, where it would remain for years, occasionally recovered in fragments by those searching the lake bed. By dawn, the survivors had broken through to the western shore. They regrouped on open ground beyond Tlacopan, exhausted and scattered. Morning light revealed the cost. More than half of the Spanish force was gone. Estimates vary, but perhaps 600 or more Spanish soldiers had been killed or captured. Many horses were dead. Tlaxcalan losses were severe, possibly numbering in the thousands, though no precise count was ever made. Weapons and supplies had been abandoned during the retreat. The treasure that had seemed so valuable now lay scattered across the lake bed, or carried by those who would not survive to spend it. Artillery pieces had been thrown into the water to prevent capture. The expedition's carefully assembled resources were gone. Cortés reportedly wept beneath a tree on the shore, surveying what remained of his force. The moment has been remembered as genuine grief, though whether for lost men or lost opportunity is unclear. The myth shattered there on the western shore. The Spaniards had entered the valley with confidence shaped by earlier successes in the Caribbean and along the coast. That confidence did not survive the night. They had not escaped through superior tactics or divine favor. They had escaped through sacrifice borne largely by their indigenous allies, through chance and through decisions made in panic that happened to lead away from death. For the Mexica, the night confirmed something essential. The strangers could bleed. They could be driven from the city. They could be killed in numbers that proved they were not invincible. The balance had shifted, even if victory remained incomplete. Cuitlahuac did not pursue the retreating force immediately. The city needed to recover, to bury the dead, to perform rituals that had been delayed for months, and to consolidate leadership now that the immediate threat had been expelled. This decision would later be debated. A full pursuit might have destroyed the Spanish force entirely, but the Mexica had suffered their own losses. The city had been damaged. Political stability required attention. The threat appeared to be over, driven into retreat with losses that should have ended the campaign. La Noche Triste, the sad night, ended with neither side secure. The Spaniards were alive but broken, their force reduced and their resources depleted. The Mexica had defended their city successfully but at enormous cost, with neighborhoods damaged and hundreds of their own warriors dead. The survivors on the western shore faced immediate challenges. They had no food, limited water, and little medical supplies. They were deep in hostile territory with thousands of Mexica warriors likely pursuing them. Tlaxcalan territory lay to the east, across valleys and mountains, at least a week's march away if they could move at all. The column began moving again after brief rest, limping eastward. They were attacked repeatedly over the following days as they crossed the valley. At Otumba, on the 7th of July, 1520, they fought a major battle that nearly destroyed them entirely. Spanish accounts claim victory through a cavalry charge that killed Mexica commanders and broke the attack. Indigenous accounts suggest the Mexica withdrew to avoid further losses after the Spaniards proved more resilient than expected. Whatever the truth, the survivors reached Tlaxcalan territory by mid-July. They had escaped Tenochtitlan, but they had not conquered it. The city remained intact and defiant. The empire, though shaken, had demonstrated the capacity to resist and inflict devastating casualties. The war had moved beyond containment. Both sides understood that coexistence was impossible. One side would have to be destroyed or subjugated completely. There would be no negotiated settlement, no return to the careful management that had briefly seemed possible. The struggle would return to the city, and it would be total. The city grew quiet after the Spaniards withdrew. Following La Noche Triste, Fires were extinguished and barricades dismantled. Bodies were removed from streets and canals, a process that took days. Damage was assessed and repairs began where resources allowed. The Mexica prepared for the war they believed would return, organizing defenses and restoring order as best they could. Then sickness appeared. It did not arrive with ceremony or warning. It moved through households rather than armies, spreading quietly through the densest neighborhoods where families lived close together. At first it was mistaken for a familiar illness. Fevers rose. People complained of pain behind the eyes and in their joints. Families cared for the sick at home, expecting recovery within days. The recovery did not come. Blisters began to form on skin, small at first, then spreading across faces and bodies. They filled with fluid and multiplied. The pain became severe. Sight failed as the lesions covered eyes. Breathing grew difficult when they formed in throats and mouths. Many died where they lay, surrounded by relatives who did not yet understand what they were witnessing. Smallpox had entered the city. The disease had traveled from Europe to the Caribbean, carried by Spanish colonists who had survived childhood exposure and now carried immunity. It had moved to the Mexican coast with subsequent Spanish expeditions. It spread to indigenous populations who had never encountered it and possessed no natural resistance. One person could infect dozens before showing symptoms. The disease required no direct contact to spread. It traveled through air, through touch, through shared spaces. In a dense city like Tenochtitlan, where families lived in close quarters and markets brought thousands together daily, smallpox found ideal conditions. The epidemic struck in October of 1520, just months after the Spaniards had been driven from the city. Death preceded any possibility of renewed battle. Warriors who should have been preparing defenses fell ill instead. Priests who maintained ritual cycles were unable to rise from their mats. Officials who enforced order disappeared from public view. The city's ability to organize itself weakened day by day. Smallpox killed without pattern or preference. Children died quickly. Adults lingered longer before succumbing. Some survived with terrible scarring and permanent blindness. Others died within days of showing symptoms. Entire families were wiped out when caregivers contracted the disease from those they tended. The scale was devastating. Modern estimates suggest that between 30 and 50% of Tenochtitlan's population died during this outbreak. In a city that had held perhaps 200,000 people, that meant tens of thousands of deaths within weeks. Leadership collapsed unevenly. Cuitlahuac, who had led resistance against the Spaniards and assumed power after Moctezuma's death, fell ill in late November or early December. He died within days. His leadership had lasted only 80 days, most of which were spent managing crisis rather than consolidating authority. His death removed a figure who had unified the city during its moment of victory. Command passed to Cuauhtemoc, a young noble in his early 20s, nephew to both Moctezuma and Cuitlahuac. He took power in a city already devastated by disease, with no time to establish legitimacy through the traditional processes that normally accompanied succession. Others followed. Nobles, warriors, priests, administrators, all died without ceremony or succession planning. Each death created a gap in the system that held the city together. Knowledge that would have been passed down through generations was lost when teachers died before students could learn. Ritual could not contain this threat. Offerings were made to gods associated with disease and healing. Calendars were consulted to determine if dangerous day signs aligned with the outbreak. Healers worked without rest, using every technique their tradition provided. Herbs were administered. Steam baths were prescribed. Incantations were spoken. None of these actions stopped the spread. The disease did not respond to patterns the Mexica understood or methods that had worked against other illnesses. It simply continued, moving from district to district until it had burned through the susceptible population. The psychological damage was immediate and profound. People who had survived war now faced an enemy they could not see, fight, or negotiate with. The sense of cosmic balance that had shaped Mexican life broke down under pressure it could not absorb. If the gods required sacrifice and devotion to maintain the world, why did they allow this? If ritual maintained order, why did order collapse despite perfect performance of ceremony? These questions had no satisfying answers. Some priests argued that the disease was punishment for insufficient devotion or errors in ritual. Others suggested it was a weapon sent by the stranger's gods, proof that foreign deities possessed power that Mexica gods could not counter. Neither explanation restored confidence in the system that had guided the city for generations. Fear changed shape entirely. Not fear of attack or betrayal, but fear of touch, of breath, of proximity to other human beings. Families isolated themselves when they could, abandoning the communal life that had defined existence in the city. Others stayed together and died together, unable to separate in spaces designed for close living. The sick were avoided, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Those who cared for the ill often contracted the disease themselves. Entire households died, with no one left to prepare bodies or perform proper funeral rites. The smell of decay filled neighborhoods where removal of the dead could not keep pace with mortality. Markets thinned and then closed entirely in some districts. The flow of goods that had sustained the city slowed to a trickle. Food became scarce, not because it did not exist, but because the networks that distributed it had broken down. Farmers who survived could not bring produce to empty markets. Merchants who survived had no customers. The city's population fell sharply over weeks. Children were left without parents. Elders died without passing on knowledge essential to maintaining chinampas, conducting ceremonies, or administering law. The social fabric tore faster than it could be repaired. Canoes carried bodies to burial sites around the lake's edge, moving in grim procession day after day. The volume overwhelmed traditional burial practices. Mass graves were dug. Rites that normally took days were compressed into hours or skipped entirely. By early 1521, perhaps 6 months after the epidemic began, the worst had passed. Those who survived possessed immunity they had purchased at terrible cost. The disease no longer found enough susceptible hosts to sustain transmission. But the city that emerged was fundamentally changed. Its people were fewer by perhaps a third or more. Leadership had turned over multiple times in months. Confidence in the ritual system had been shaken. The networks of obligation and exchange that sustained daily life had been disrupted. As word reached Tlaxcala and Spanish camps outside the valley that disease had struck Tenochtitlan, Cortés understood the opportunity. His forces had spent months recovering from La Noche Triste, rebuilding strength with Tlaxcalan support. They had recruited additional Spanish soldiers from ships arriving on the coast. They had constructed brigantines, small sailing vessels in pieces, planning to carry them over the mountains and assemble them on the lake. The plan had always been to return to Tenochtitlan, but returning to a city weakened by epidemic was vastly different than confronting the force that had driven them out in June. The Spaniards had not caused the epidemic. They had not deployed smallpox as a weapon. The disease spread through natural transmission, an unintended but catastrophic consequence of contact between populations with no shared disease history. But they would benefit from it enormously. When Spanish and Allied forces began advancing toward the valley in late December of 1520, they found a region transformed. Towns that had resisted before were now depleted and uncertain. The Mexica tributary system that had once projected power was fractured by loss and confusion. Tenochtitlan prepared to defend itself, but it was already wounded before the siege began. The city had lost massive numbers of people. Its leadership was new and untested. Its confidence in divine protection had been undermined by a disaster that ritual could not prevent or explain. The war for Tenochtitlan would be decided by siege, starvation, and street-by-street fighting over months. But the city had already lost something essential before the first brigantine touched the lake. It had lost the certainty that the world operated according to understandable patterns, that devotion guaranteed protection, and that the fifth sun would continue as long as proper rituals were maintained. That certainty would not return, even if the city somehow survived what was coming. Dawn broke over Lake Texcoco on the 26th of December, 1520, with an unfamiliar sound. Oars struck water in coordinated rhythm. The surface of the lake rippled beneath vessels that had not existed there months earlier. 13 brigantines, built in pieces beyond the valley and reassembled at the water's edge under Spanish direction, moved steadily toward the city. Their sails caught the morning light. Their hulls sat low in the water, designed for the shallow lake rather than ocean travel. Cannons were mounted on their decks, small pieces but sufficient to threaten canoes and shoreline positions. Their presence changed the balance immediately and fundamentally. The lake had once protected Tenochtitlan, serving as a barrier that channeled all approaches through easily defended causeways. Now it carried the enemy directly to the city's edges. Cortés had returned with preparation rather than haste. His forces were larger than before, reinforced by additional Spanish soldiers who had arrived on the coast seeking opportunity. Indigenous allies numbered in the tens of thousands, primarily Tlaxcalan warriors, but also forces from other communities that had defected from the Mexica orbit or saw advantage in joining what appeared to be the stronger side. Supply lines were secured. The approach was methodical, shaped by lessons learned during the earlier disaster. This time there would be no dependence on diplomacy or assumption that the city could be controlled from within. The plan was siege, isolate, starve, and reduce the city piece by piece until resistance became impossible. The brigantines controlled the water. They disrupted canoe traffic that normally moved food, goods, and people across the lake. They intercepted supply lines from the mainland. They supported attacks along the causeways by providing covering fire and preventing Mexica forces from attacking Spanish columns from the water. The Mexica had relied on mobility across the lake to move resources and coordinate defense. That movement narrowed immediately and then stopped as the brigantines established dominance through superior size, firepower, and ability to move regardless of wind or current. Inside the city, scarcity arrived before starvation. The aqueduct from Chapultepec that brought fresh water to Tenochtitlan was cut within the first weeks of the siege. The Spanish-led coalition occupied the springs and destroyed sections of the aqueduct. The city's population was forced to rely on wells and rainwater collected in cisterns. Wells became strategic positions, defended and fought over. Water quality deteriorated as use intensified. Contamination spread disease through neighborhoods already weakened by the smallpox epidemic that had ravaged the city months earlier. Markets thinned as merchants could no longer bring goods from the mainland. The chinampas around the city still produced food, but access to outlying agricultural areas became dangerous. Farmers who ventured out to tend their plots risked attack. Harvests rotted in fields that could not be safely reached. Families rationed what remained. Stored maize was measured carefully. Beans and preserved foods were stretched as far as possible. Hunger spread unevenly, striking the poor before those connected to remaining power structures, but eventually reaching everyone as the siege extended from weeks into months. Cuauhtémoc organized resistance with the resources available to him. He was young, in his early 20s, and had not been prepared to assume leadership under these conditions. But he possessed energy, determination, and the clarity that comes from having no illusions about the situation. The city would not be saved through negotiation. It would endure or fall based on how long its people could resist. Barricades were raised across the causeways. Bridges were destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly as fighting surged back and forth. Warriors adapted tactics to the changing character of combat, striking quickly through canals and narrow streets they knew intimately, then withdrawing before Spanish firearms and cavalry could be brought to bear. The siege settled into a pattern of daily violence. Spanish and Allied forces attacked along the causeways, advancing incrementally toward the city center. Each advance met resistance measured in hours rather than days. Progress was slow and costly. Mexica defenders used rooftops, canals, and narrow passages to their advantage, inflicting casualties that accumulated despite Spanish technological advantages. Street-by-street fighting replaced open battle. Homes became fortifications. Families fled or sheltered in place as combat moved through their neighborhoods. Rooftops turned into firing positions for both sides. Civilians moved through back passages carrying food, water, and messages under fire. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred under pressure. The city began to shrink physically. Districts closest to the causeways fell first, captured after intense fighting, or abandoned when defense became untenable. Survivors fled inward, compressing the population into smaller areas with each retreat. Each withdrawal reduced access to resources and made the next defense more difficult. The Spanish-led coalition employed a strategy of systematic destruction. Buildings were dismantled after capture to prevent reuse as defensive positions. Canals were filled with rubble to create paths for cavalry and to deny the Mexica mobility through waterways. What had once supported urban life was reduced to deny shelter and movement to defenders. The advance was deliberate. Secure one section completely before moving forward. Fill the canals behind you to prevent counterattack. Leave nothing standing that could be fortified again. This approach took time, but achieved its purpose. The city was not just captured, but erased systematically, building by building, canal by canal. Starvation deepened as weeks turned to months. By February of 1521, food stocks were severely depleted. By March, hunger dominated daily existence. Families ate whatever could be found: dogs that had been kept as companions, birds, insects, reeds from the lake, tree bark. Leather was boiled to extract any nutrition. Anything that could sustain life for another day was consumed. Children and the elderly weakened first. Their bodies had fewer reserves to draw upon. Mortality increased not just from violence, but from malnutrition and diseases that thrived in weakened populations. Cuauhtémoc attempted to maintain morale through personal example. He fought alongside warriors rather than directing from safety. He visited defenders throughout the city, offering encouragement and maintaining the appearance of confidence. He redistributed what food remained, ensuring that warriors received enough to continue fighting even as civilian populations starved. His presence mattered. Warriors fought knowing their leader shared their danger rather than observing from a distance. But presence could not replace food or water or medical care. By April, the siege had been underway for 4 months. The city was perhaps half its original size, with outer districts destroyed or abandoned. The population was compressed into the center, living in increasingly desperate conditions. Thirst forced people into risks they could not afford, attempting to draw water from contaminated sources or breaking through Spanish lines to reach cleaner supplies. Water became as dangerous as it was necessary. Contaminated sources spread dysentery and other illnesses. Canoes attempting to cross the lake to gather water were intercepted by brigantines. The choice became drinking fouled water or dying of thirst. Either option led to weakening and death, only at different speeds. Despite all this, resistance continued. Warriors fought knowing the outcome was narrowing toward collapse. The defense was no longer about victory in any conventional sense. It was about delaying the end, preserving autonomy for another day, maintaining dignity through continued resistance even when success became impossible. The Spaniards and their allies advanced cautiously through May and June. They suffered losses in close quarters, fighting where Mexican knowledge of the terrain provided advantage. Obsidian-edged weapons still killed when they connected. Rooftop positions allowed defenders to strike at exposed columns. Progress required clearing each space fully before moving on, a process that was slow and dangerous. Exhaustion overtook both sides as summer heat intensified the siege conditions. For the besieged, exhaustion meant progressive weakening from hunger and disease. Bodies that had once been capable of sustained fighting could no longer endure. Wounds that might have healed instead became infected in unsanitary conditions. Illness spread through crowded spaces where families sheltered together. For the attackers, exhaustion meant attrition and frustration. Spanish casualties mounted from disease, ambush, and the grinding nature of urban combat. Indigenous allies bore most of the losses, fighting house to house through neighborhoods that resisted fiercely even as they collapsed. The difference lay in supply. One side could replace losses and resupply their forces. The other could not. By July of 1521, 7 months after the siege began, the remaining defenders were concentrated in Tlatelolco, the northern district of the city. Tenochtitlan no longer functioned as a city in any recognizable sense. It was a series of ruins connected by narrow paths, holding people who had nowhere else to go. Markets had ceased to exist months earlier. The great temple complex lay partially destroyed. The palace where Moctezuma had governed was rubble. The lake reflected smoke and debris where temples and organized neighborhoods had once stood. The causeways were broken and rebuilt so many times that their original form was barely visible beneath layers of destruction and repair. Still, the city continued to resist. Not because victory remained possible, but because surrender offered little certainty of survival and no guarantee of dignity. The people of Tenochtitlan had watched the systematic destruction of everything they had built. They had endured hunger, disease, and violence that continued without pause for months. They maintained endurance under conditions that allowed no relief. The siege did not end with a dramatic collapse or sudden breakthrough. It ended with exhaustion, accumulating day after day after day, until nothing remained that could sustain further resistance. The fall was approaching, not as an event, but as the inevitable conclusion of months without food, water, medical care, or rest. The city that had dominated the valley for generations was being erased piece by piece, not in a single moment of conquest, but through sustained pressure that allowed no recovery and no escape. Morning came on the 13th of August, 1521, without relief. The lake lay heavy with debris. Smoke drifted from collapsed buildings. What remained of Tenochtitlan was compressed into a final section of Tlatelolco, where people crowded together amid rubble and stagnant water. Movement was slow, careful, and dangerous. The city no longer offered shelter or order. It offered only the illusion of sanctuary that shrank hourly. Cuauhtemoc remained in command of what could still be called resistance. He had led the defense for 8 months, from his assumption of power during the smallpox epidemic through the entire siege. He was approximately 25 years old. His authority rested on circumstance rather than the elaborate processes that normally legitimized Mexica rulership. He had taken leadership when delay was no longer possible, when the city required resistance instead of negotiation. Those who followed him understood the situation without illusion. There was no expectation of victory. The resistance continued because surrender offered little certainty and potentially less dignity than fighting to the end. Hunger had weakened bodies to the point where sustained combat was barely possible. Disease lingered in the compressed spaces where families sheltered. Water remained scarce and contaminated. Still, defenders fought where they could. They used narrow passages and ruined structures to slow the Spanish-led coalition's advance. Each day bought time that could not be measured in strategic advantage, but only in continued existence. Warriors too weak to stand fought from seated positions. Those who could no longer fight carried messages, tended wounded, or simply maintained presence to show that resistance had not ended. Cuauhtemoc moved constantly through what remained of the city. He shifted command posts to avoid capture, directing defense from different locations as each position became untenable. Messengers carried instructions through flooded streets and across piles of rubble. Small groups attacked where opportunity appeared, then withdrew before brigantines or infantry could respond effectively. The Spaniards and their allies pressed inward methodically. Allied indigenous forces filled gaps left by retreating defenders. The remaining districts were reduced using the same systematic approach that had worked for months: capture, destroy, fill the canals, move forward. Each cleared section erased another portion of daily life. What had once supported tens of thousands was dismantled to prevent any possibility of renewed resistance. Civilians remained trapped within the fighting. Families sheltered in whatever structures still offered protection from rain and attack. Children scavenged for anything edible. Parents made choices about which child might receive a final portion of food and which would go without. The distinction between defender and survivor had collapsed under the pressure of starvation. The Spanish coalition offered terms repeatedly during the final weeks. Surrender now and live. Continue resisting and face total destruction. The terms were communicated through intermediaries and messages that reached Cuauhtémoc despite the chaos. He refused consistently, not from pride, but from understanding that surrender guaranteed nothing and ended all autonomy. Some defenders might be spared, others would be enslaved. Leadership would certainly face execution or extended captivity. The difference between surrender and continued resistance was perhaps measured in days, but those days remained under Mexica terms rather than Spanish dictation. By mid-August of 1521, resistance was concentrated in a final core of Tlatelolco, barely larger than a few city blocks. The market that had once drawn tens of thousands daily was gone. The temples were damaged or destroyed. The northern palace complex was rubble. Fresh water no longer flowed. The smell of unburied bodies filled the air. Disease spread through crowds that could not disperse, because there was nowhere to go. Cuauhtémoc attempted one final action on the 13th of August. He organized an escape attempt by water, seeking to break through Spanish naval control with canoes carrying key leaders and warriors. If they could reach the mainland, perhaps resistance could continue from beyond the city. Perhaps they could regroup with communities that still resisted, or at least preserve leadership for whatever came after. The attempt was made under cover of evening, using remaining canoes that had been hidden during earlier phases of the siege. They slipped through channels that had once carried trade, moving as quietly as possible toward open water. Spanish brigantines intercepted them. The vessels had maintained patrol patterns for months, anticipating exactly this kind of escape attempt. Canoes were surrounded and forced to surrender or be sunk. Cuauhtémoc was identified and taken captive. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some describe him fighting until overwhelmed. Others suggest he surrendered when resistance became clearly futile. He was brought before Cortés, marking the effective end of organized Mexica resistance. The capture did not stop all fighting immediately. Some defenders continued until they were forced back into the final structures or killed where they stood. Others surrendered when it became clear that leadership had been removed and further resistance served no purpose. The collapse unfolded unevenly over hours, district by district, position by position. By nightfall on the 13th of August, 1521, the fighting had ended. The city fell without ceremony or final dramatic battle that decided everything. It fell through exhaustion, hunger, and the absence of alternatives. The siege had lasted nearly 8 months. The broader conflict from the Spaniards' first arrival to the city's fall had consumed 2 years and 6 months. Cuauhtémoc was brought before Cortés and questioned. Spanish sources describe him asking to be killed rather than humiliated. Cortés reportedly spared him initially, believing he might be useful for pacifying remaining resistance elsewhere. The reality was more complex. Cuauhtémoc represented legitimacy in Mexica terms. His survival allowed Spanish authorities to claim they ruled through him rather than by pure conquest. He was kept under guard, treated with formal respect, but denied freedom. His presence offered little comfort to those who had lost everything around him. Tenochtitlan was silent. The lake reflected broken stone and bodies floating among debris. Temples stood damaged or dismantled. Markets were empty. The causeways were barely recognizable under layers of destruction. The city that had once governed the valley no longer functioned as a city. Survivors emerged slowly from hiding places. They moved carefully through ruins, looking for family members, food, or anything that might sustain another day. Many were too weak to walk far. They sat where they were, unable to decide what mattered next or whether anything mattered at all. Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies moved through the captured city with different purposes. Some searched for treasure that might still be hidden. Others secured positions for the occupation that would follow. Tlaxcalan warriors and other allied forces settled scores that had nothing to do with Spanish objectives, attacking survivors who represented old grudges, or simply taking what they wanted from people too weak to resist. The violence did not end with the city's fall. It shifted form. The end did not feel like conquest celebrated in later accounts. It felt like removal. The last emperor had been taken. The resistance had nowhere else to go. The city finally fell, not through a single decisive act, but through the steady exhaustion of people who could no longer continue. What followed would reshape the land and its memory in ways that those who lived through it could not yet fully comprehend. What was lost would be remembered by those who survived long enough to speak, to record, to ensure that Tenochtitlan did not disappear entirely into silence. Dawn revealed what months of fighting had left behind. Smoke lifted slowly from the lake, carrying the smell of decay that would linger for weeks. Rubble lay where homes and temples had stood. Bodies remained where they had fallen, some in water, some on stone. Many left untouched, because there was no one with strength left to move them. The sounds that had once filled the city were gone. No drums marked the hours. No markets opened. No canoes moved with purpose across the water. Silence settled unevenly across ruins. Those who survived moved carefully through what remained. Some searched for family members, calling names into empty spaces and receiving no answer. Others looked for food or clean water, anything that might sustain another day. Many did neither. They sat where they were, unable to decide what mattered next. The city no longer functioned as a place. Causeways were broken beyond easy repair. Canals were clogged with rubble and bodies. The order that had organized daily life for generations had been dismantled piece by piece during the siege. What remained offered no clear direction, no familiar routines to restore meaning. Survivors tried to understand what had happened. They spoke quietly among themselves when they had strength to speak, comparing memories and losses. Some returned to rituals, repeating gestures that had once provided structure, though the temples where those rituals belonged were destroyed, and the priests who had led them were mostly dead. Others abandoned ceremony entirely, unsure what meaning it still held. If the gods had demanded devotion and sacrifice to maintain the fifth sun, why had the world ended despite perfect performance of obligation? If cosmic balance depended on ritual, why had balance collapsed so completely? These questions circulated without resolution. Spanish forces moved through the city with immediate purpose. They secured strategic positions, counted survivors, and marked sites for rebuilding according to plans already being made. Indigenous allies gathered captives, settling old scores, and redistributing power in ways that had nothing to do with Spanish authority. Violence did not end with the fall. It shifted form and targets. Women and children were taken as slaves. Warriors who survived were identified and marked for different treatment than civilians. Some were kept for forced labor. Others were claimed by Allied forces as payment for their participation in the siege. The distribution followed no single system, but rather multiple overlapping claims by different groups with different objectives. Cuauhtémoc remained in Spanish custody. His survival served Spanish purposes by maintaining a connection to Mexican legitimacy. Cortés used him to issue orders meant to pacify remaining resistance in areas beyond the capital. But Cuauhtémoc's authority was hollow, exercised only as Spanish power permitted, and in service of conquest rather than Mexica interests. In February of 1525, approximately 3.5 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spanish authorities executed him. The circumstances were politically motivated, growing from Spanish fears during an expedition to Honduras that indigenous leaders might organize rebellion. Cuauhtémoc was hanged along with other nobles. His death ended the last connection to legitimate Mexica rulership. Tenochtitlan itself was dismantled systematically. Stone was pulled from temples and palaces, the same stone that had been quarried and shaped and fitted by Mexica laborers over generations. Canals were filled permanently, transforming water streets into land roads designed for horses and carts rather than canoes. The island city's relationship to the lake was fundamentally altered. Mexico City replaced Tenochtitlan. The transformation was deliberate and comprehensive. The old city was not preserved or incorporated. It was erased and built over, its layout altered to break continuity with the past. Spanish colonial architecture rose on Mexica foundations, using indigenous labor but following European designs. Churches were built on temple platforms, physically occupying the sacred spaces that had organized Mexica's spiritual life. The cathedral would eventually stand where the great temple had stood, a replacement meant to demonstrate both physical and spiritual conquest. For the survivors, memory became the only remaining structure. Those who lived through the fall carried the story forward in words rather than monuments. They described hunger, fear, and loss to children who would never see the city as it had been. They remembered names and places that no longer existed except in recollection. Some of these accounts were recorded years later by Spanish priests interested in understanding the world they had helped destroy. The most important was compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who worked with Mexican informants to document their history, beliefs, and the story of the conquest from their perspective. These accounts were efforts to make sense of survival, when survival itself felt uncertain. They tried to preserve meaning from a world that had collapsed so completely that younger generations would have no direct memory of it. The accounts described daily life before the conquest, how chinampas were maintained, how markets operated, how rituals were performed, how justice was administered. They described the omens that preceded the fall. They described the violence in detail that still carries emotional weight 5 centuries later. In these memories, Tenochtitlan remained alive, not as stone or water, but as a lived world that had required care, discipline, and constant attention. The loss was not only of buildings or political power, but of a way of organizing existence that had seemed permanent until it suddenly was not. The survivors adapted because they had no choice. Some found places within the new colonial order, working as translators, administrators, or laborers in the city being built over their own. Others were displaced to settlements on the edges of the valley, or absorbed into the encomienda system that granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous labor. Many died in the years immediately following the conquest from continued disease, overwork, and the general collapse of social structures that had sustained life. The population of central Mexico declined catastrophically in the 16th century, falling perhaps 90% from pre-contact levels, due to epidemic disease, violence, social disruption, and economic extraction. The empire that had radiated from Tenochtitlan fragmented into pieces controlled by different Spanish authorities, indigenous leaders who collaborated with colonization, and communities that resisted as best they could while adapting to irreversible change. What had been destroyed could not be rebuilt. The island city would not return. Its rituals would not resume as they had been performed. Its political authority would not be restored. The system that had organized power, meaning, and daily routine was broken beyond repair. Memory remained. Preserved in testimony, passed down through generations, recorded by those who knew the city before it, fell and understood what had been lost. The ruins disappeared beneath new streets and walls as construction continued through the colonial period. Occasionally, workers would uncover fragments, carved stones, sculptures, offerings buried in temple foundations. These discoveries were often destroyed or ignored, treated as remnants of a pagan past better forgotten than preserved. The lake itself changed over centuries. Drainage projects begun in the colonial period and intensified in later eras reduced Lake Texcoco to a fraction of its original size. The water that had once surrounded and protected Tenochtitlan was channeled away, leaving the city sitting on drained lake bed rather than rising from an island. Modern Mexico City sprawls across the valley, home to more than 20 million people. The Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, was partially excavated in the 1970s and 80s, after utility workers accidentally discovered it beneath the colonial center. Visitors can now see the layers of construction, each representing an earlier phase of the temple's expansion. But what they see are fragments, enough to suggest scale and complexity, not enough to restore the living city that once stood there. The story endures because people remembered and spoke, because Mexica survivors insisted on recording what happened, even when recording meant working with Spanish authorities who had participated in destruction. Because memory mattered enough to preserve despite trauma, grief, and the knowledge that preservation would not restore what had been lost. Tenochtitlan survives in that memory, in accounts written decades after the fall by people who had been children during the siege, in songs and stories passed down through families, in the Nahuatl language still spoken by more than 1 million people today, in place names throughout central Mexico that preserve pre-Hispanic vocabulary. It survives in the physical landscape, where causeways became modern streets and neighborhoods retain names from the original city. It survives in markets that still operate on the same sites where trade occurred 500 years ago, though the goods and currency have changed. Most powerfully, it survives in the refusal to let conquest erase existence. The Mexica did not vanish when Tenochtitlan fell. They continued, adapted, resisted, and preserved what they could through centuries of colonization, independence movements, revolution, and modernization. Indigenous identity in Mexico remains connected to that history, claiming descent not from conquest, but from the civilizations that existed before it. The fall of Tenochtitlan marks a boundary between worlds, before and after. The world before, where the fifth sun governed time and sacrifice, maintained cosmic balance, where the island city controlled the valley through tribute and force, where ritual structured existence and hierarchy was understood through generations of precedent. The world after, where that system collapsed and could not be restored, where new powers imposed new structures, where survival required adaptation that preserved fragments while surrendering the whole. The boundary is clear, but memory crosses it, carrying forward stories meant to ensure that the city, the people, and the world they created together would not be forgotten entirely. Morning returns to the lake. Light settles across water that no longer reflects temples or causeways. The lake itself is much reduced, drawn down by centuries of drainage projects that turned wetland into buildable land. What remains is a shadow of the vast water system that once surrounded Tenochtitlan. Canoes still move on the remaining canals south of the city, in Xochimilco, where chinampas are still maintained, and tourists pay to be paddled past floating gardens that preserve agricultural techniques developed centuries ago. But these are fragments, maintained partly for cultural heritage and partly for tourism, not the working infrastructure of an imperial capital. Stone rises where stone once stood, but arranged according to a different plan. The streets of modern Mexico City do not follow the pattern of Mexica Tenochtitlan. They follow the grid imposed by Spanish colonial authorities, straight lines radiating from a central plaza rather than the organic network of canals and causeways that once defined movement through the city. Tenochtitlan had been a way of organizing the world. Time was structured by interlocking calendars that gave each day multiple meanings. Power was visible in stone monuments, water management, and the controlled movement of tribute. Obligations shaped daily life at every level, from the farmer tending chinampas to the emperor performing rituals that maintained cosmic balance. People understood themselves as part of a system that demanded care and restraint. Individual choices mattered because they contributed to collective survival. The fifth sun continued because effort sustained it. History moved in cycles that could be anticipated and prepared for through proper observation and response. When the city fell, that entire framework collapsed. The calendars lost their authority when the rituals they governed could no longer be performed. The tribute system ended when there was no center to receive it. The cosmic obligations that had structured existence became impossible to fulfill when the temples were destroyed and the priesthood decimated. What could not be rebuilt was preserved in words. Survivors carried this loss quietly. They adapted because survival required it. They learned Spanish or worked within colonial structures. They converted to Christianity, though often maintaining older beliefs alongside newer ones in ways that created hybrid practices. Colonial authorities struggled to control. But they also spoke to one another. They described the city as it had been, not to restore it. They understood restoration was impossible, but to keep it from disappearing entirely into silence and forgetting. They recalled ceremonies that would never be performed again, markets that would never reopen, songs that were sung for the last time, names of gods who would no longer receive offerings, techniques for reading the calendar that had no practical application in the world that came after, but mattered as knowledge worth preserving. These accounts were attempts to hold meaning together after collapse. They explained how the world had been understood before it failed. They recorded confusion, fear, and endurance without resolving them into neat explanations or moral lessons. Language became the last structure that remained. Through testimony, the city survived as memory rather than stone. The past endured not as monument, but as experience, passed forward from those who lived it to those who came after. Nahuatl carried this memory in its vocabulary, its place names, its ways of describing relationships between people and the world. The language survived colonization, though it changed and fragmented into regional varieties. It survived centuries where Spanish was imposed as the language of power, religion, and advancement. It survives today, spoken by approximately 1.5 million people across Mexico, a living connection to the world before conquest. The fall of Tenochtitlan involved courage and calculation on all sides, restraint and violence, cooperation and resistance, moments where different choices might have led to different outcomes, and moments where the outcome was already determined by factors beyond anyone's control. The Mexica leadership attempted to manage an unprecedented threat using tools designed for familiar problems. They delayed when immediate action might have worked better. They acted when delay might have preserved more options. They made reasonable decisions that led to catastrophe, because the situation was not reasonable and gave no clear signals about which approach would succeed. The Spaniards and their indigenous allies exploited divisions that already existed within the empire. They benefited enormously from diseases they did not intentionally deploy, but that devastated populations with no immunity. They pursued objectives shaped by European ambitions in a context they did not fully understand and could not fully control. The indigenous allies who joined the Spanish campaign had their own reasons, their own histories of conflict with Tenochtitlan, their own objectives that had nothing to do with European conquest. They fought and died in numbers far exceeding Spanish casualties, pursuing opportunities to reshape power in ways that would benefit their communities. All of these threads mattered. Pulling any single one and claiming it explains everything distorts what actually happened. Civilizations do not disappear all at once. They unravel through decisions that once made sense within systems designed for different challenges. They are weakened by events beyond their design, by threats they were not structured to recognize or contain. They persist through adaptation even after the structures that defined them have collapsed. The Mexica did not vanish when Tenochtitlan fell. They survived in families, in language, in memory, in practices that continued even when their original context was destroyed. They adapted to colonization while maintaining identities that claimed continuity with the world before conquest. They resisted erasure through preservation of knowledge, through insistence on speaking their language, through refusal to let conquest define them entirely. Indigenous communities throughout Mexico today understand themselves as connected to that history, not as museum pieces or remnants of a vanished past, but as living peoples whose ancestors survived catastrophe and whose identities remain shaped by what came before as much as what came after. The loss was real and catastrophic. Population collapse, cultural destruction, political subordination, economic exploitation. These were not abstractions, but lived realities that shaped generations. But survival was also real. The preservation of language, stories, agricultural techniques, artistic traditions, spiritual practices that merged old and new into forms that served changed circumstances. The continuation of identity across centuries that attempted to erase it. As the day settles and what remains of the lake grows quiet, the outlines of the old city persist beneath the surface. Not visible to casual observation, not recoverable in their original form, but present in street names derived from Nahuatl, in neighborhoods that follow boundaries established before conquest, in markets that occupy sites where trade occurred 500 years ago, in the lakebed that still shifts beneath modern buildings, causing them to sink slowly into ground that remembers being water. The Great Temple stands partially excavated in the heart of modern Mexico City, its layers visible to visitors who descend into the archaeological site. Each layer represents an expansion, a rebuilding, a moment when the Mexica added to what their predecessors had created. The structure grew over time, accumulating history in stone. It stopped growing in 1521, but it did not disappear. It was buried, built over, forgotten for centuries. And then it was found again, rediscovered in the 1970s when workers installing electrical cables broke through into the ceremonial precinct. The discovery required rethinking what Mexico City was built on and what remained beneath. It required acknowledging that the indigenous past was not safely distant, but literally underfoot, embedded in the foundation of the modern city. The city fell. The empire collapsed. The world that the Mexica had organized around maintaining the fifth sun ended when the structures supporting it were destroyed. But the people survived. The memory survived. The language survived. The insistence on being more than conquest victims survived. The story of Tenochtitlan's fall is also the story of continuation through catastrophe, of knowledge preserved when institutions that held it collapsed, of identity maintained when the political structures that expressed it were destroyed, of memory carried forward because forgetting would have meant a second death more complete than the first. As night approaches again over the valley, lights illuminate a city of more than 20 million people. The vast metropolitan area sprawls far beyond the lake that once defined boundaries. Buildings rise where water once protected an island capital. Streets carry traffic where canoes once moved in silence. The modern city has its own life, its own rhythms, its own relationship to this place. It is not trying to be Tenochtitlan. It is something else entirely, shaped by colonial history, independence, revolution, and the choices of millions of people who live here now. But beneath it, in the ground and in memory, Tenochtitlan persists. Not as a place that can be restored or visited, except through imagination and fragments, but as a reminder that what seems permanent can end, that civilizations rise and fall, that catastrophe can be survived even when it cannot be prevented. And as evidence that memory, carefully preserved and passed forward, can outlast stone. The fifth sun that the Mexica believed they were sustaining through ritual and sacrifice continues to rise each morning, not because of their offerings, those ended in 1521, but because it operates according to patterns they did not control, and we understand differently. Yet their understanding mattered. Their efforts to maintain cosmic balance shaped how they organized their world, how they understood obligation, how they faced challenges, including the one that finally overwhelmed them. That understanding is part of human history, part of the variety of ways people have organized, meaning, and sought to ensure continuity across generations. It deserves to be remembered not as an exotic curiosity or a cautionary tale, but as a serious attempt by serious people to sustain their world through discipline, devotion, and careful attention to patterns they believed governed existence. They were wrong about some things. The world does not depend on human sacrifice. The sun will rise regardless of ritual. But they were not wrong about everything. They understood that civilizations require maintenance. That balance is fragile. That warning signs matter even when their meaning is unclear. That choices made under pressure can lead to catastrophe no matter how carefully they are considered. They understood that memory preserves what stone cannot, that stories matter, that who we were shapes who we become. These understandings survived the fall of Tenochtitlan. They survived in the words of those who remembered and spoke. And they survive now, 500 years later, in the continued telling of this story. Not as celebration or condemnation, but as witness. This happened. These people lived. Their city stood. It fell. They endured. And in the enduring, they ensured that Tenochtitlan would not vanish entirely into silence. The story continues because memory continues, because descendants still speak Nahuatl, because the city's name persists, because the temple has been excavated and stands visible again, because people still gather to acknowledge what happened here and what it meant. The lake is mostly gone. The temples are ruins. The empire is history. But the memory remains. And in that memory, Tenochtitlan still stands at the center of the world, its temples rising from the water, its markets filled with voices, its people tending chinampas and performing rituals that maintain the fifth sun. Not as it was. That world ended and cannot return. But as it is remembered, and remembering matters, it is the last gift the survivors gave to us, the insistence that their world existed, that it mattered, that its ending was not inevitable or deserved, and that we should know what was lost when Tenochtitlan fell. In memory, in language, in the ground beneath Mexico City, in the continued existence of people who claimed descent from those who survived. Chart, not forgotten, not fully recoverable, but remembered, and in being remembered, still present,